Hey everyone, Brandon Quinn here, thanks for joining. So for the last few months I've been looking forward to recording this video where I go over all of my monthly book recommendations for this year, the year of 2024. You can say it all started back last October when I first published my author website in anticipation of my book launch, Method Matters, which successfully launched in December 1st of last year. So with the website comes a blog, and ever since then I've been regularly posting either author updates or just articles of varying topics. A couple of months after I started the blog, I decided to start a monthly book recommendation on the blog. So I published the first book recommendation this March, and ever since I've been going strong. Every month comes a new book recommendation, and I plan to continue that for the foreseeable future. So in this video, I'll be going over all of my book recommendations, and I'll spend a couple of minutes discussing what I liked about the book and why I recommended it. And I also have all of the links to both the books themselves and my reviews on my blogs in the description below. So this year we have 10 books in total. Let's dive in. So first up is Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is one of the rare instances where both the book and the movie were phenomenal. A little bit of history before I go into the details. Typically, a movie will be based on a book, or the book will be based on a movie, but in this particular case, the book and movie were written concurrently, which I find a little bit interesting. So, I did watch the movie as well as read the book, and both of them have the same overarching storylines. At a high level, everything's the same. There are some certain minor, maybe even some non-minor details that are different, but overall they tell the same story, and they both do so flawlessly. I'd consider this book especially to be complete, for lack of a better word, complete in its storytelling, in the way the themes are intermeshed within the pages of the book. Diving into some of the specifics, right, the book is about traveling in space. I mean, it's not really about that, that's just one of the big elements of it. There's so many bigger themes in that, but what I like about the space aspect of the storytelling is that it perfectly encapsulates one, the loneliness in space, right? You're in a small box, essentially, millions of miles away from Earth. Farther from Earth than any other human has ever been, with maybe a small handful of other people, some of them cryogenically frozen. So the book does touch upon the theme of loneliness very well. It also does a very good job of demonstrating how slowly things move in space. Space is a place we have very little control over. For example, if you want to drive your car somewhere, you just get in your car, you drive it, you can switch directions at any point, stop, go at any point, but when you're traveling in space, everything's calculated ahead of time. There is no sudden changing directions without putting yourself in danger of never returning back home. So everything has to be executed slowly, methodically. Huge effort goes into seemingly small actions, and the book does a very good job of conveying that. So the science fiction element of the story is on point. Beyond the science fiction, the book delves into themes of humanity and humanity's role in the universe. Right? I don't want to spoil the book too much. I'll say that at first there is signs of alien life discovered via huge monolith on the moon. So then we start getting these big questions, right? How old is this civilization that must be at least millions of years old based on what occurred in the book? So how do we fit in with that? How do we fit in with the grand scheme of things? And I love the way the book kind of addresses that through its character interactions and storytelling. And overall, the book is an excellent example of a slow burn story. There's a constant tension rising throughout, but it's very subtly increased as the story goes on until we get to a fascinating conclusion. In fact, I like this book so much, I did read all of the sequels, right? There's 4 in total. So 2001, 2010, 2051, and 3001. All part of the series. And funny enough, I think the quality ever so slightly declines from book to book, but even then it's still so high from the start that the last book is still very much worth the read. So I highly encourage you to check out this book. Do what I did, get the entire book series, and just read it cover to 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 cover, and I promise you'll thank me for it. So with that, let's move on to the next book. So next up is Greg Egan's Diaspora. This book was my first introduction to Greg Egan, and as I was reading halfway through the first chapter, I knew for a fact this would be my book recommendation for April this year. Right, I could tell right away the author has a very unique style of writing. In this first chapter, he describes the process of creation of an artificial life form, a quasi-human artificial life form, we'll say, but he writes it in such a way that it makes the process sound natural, lifelike, joyous, even playful. It was very unique and it was very lovely to read. So I already knew at that point I would love the rest of this book, and I did. Over and over again, my decision to make it the book of the month was proven correct. It also foreshadowed the fact that the rest of the book would be very heavy into the science fiction. This author does not shy away at all whatsoever from complex scientific topics. Some of them being based in real science today, some of them being the pseudoscience that, or I should say quasi-science that science fiction writers have no choice but to engage in, given that we're not actually at that level of technology. But that's definitely something I love about this book. It comes as somewhat of a double-edged sword, though, because for readers who are less familiar with scientific topics, maybe who are new to the genre, it can be a little bit difficult for them to follow along. So if you're one of those readers, I encourage you to just try to dive in as much as you can, follow along as much as you can, and if you are having some trouble with science fiction concepts, don't worry, because you can still perfectly follow along with the storyline itself, even if you get lost in some of the specific science fiction elements. What I found interesting about this author is there are some science fiction concepts I thought of myself possibly to include in future stories I write, science fiction concepts I've not seen yet, right, incorporated into other authors' stories, movies, anything like that. Until Greg Egan beat me to it, of course. He included at least 3 or 4 ideas I'd thought of that I'd never seen before, and he even phrased it, conceptualized it in a similar way that I would myself, which I found highly interesting. So, even though he beat me to it, I'm glad that it was in the book. It was very good to see that in paper. I guess I'll just have to think of some other things. Other than the science fiction, the story spans over years, decades, centuries, eons, and throughout these huge spans of time, the author delves into a lot of philosophical concepts, and through his characters expresses competing viewpoints within those philosophies. So the book definitely has a lot on its mind, and it explores a lot of things beyond the realm of science fiction. And there's a lot to think about, a lot to contemplate in here. Unfortunately, I can't go into any specifics without ruining the storyline. But even beyond the science fiction, there's just so much to read in this book, right? So much to consider, so much to learn from it, even as I did. All of these things these competing ideas come back together full circle at the end of the book to form what I consider to be a really beautiful ending. Similar to the last book, I would consider this one to be complete in and of its own right, in its completeness of the representation of all of its ideas, philosophical, scientific, and even within the characters themselves. So with that, let's move on to the next book. Next up, we have Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes collections. So this isn't a single book. This is a compilation of all of his short stories and novellas. 4 of these stories in here are novella length, almost the length of a novel, but not quite, and the rest of them follow the short story format. So just a quick note before I go into these stories themselves. Most people who are familiar with Sherlock Holmes know him from the movies and TV shows, but the original Sherlock Holmes character and the stories themselves are vastly different, right? In a lot of the movies and TV shows, he's supremely larger than life. He's a genius beyond a genius, playing games of the highest levels. And his personality is beyond strange in some cases, very out there. Right? He's much more down to earth in these stories. Right? He is still a fictional genius, and he still is out there somewhat in his personality, but it's nowhere near the scale of what you'd expect to see today in a modern representation of the stories. I like to use the analogy of Marvel's Captain America. In the original comics, his capabilities were described as being beyond the capabilities of even humans at their peak, but it was a little bit beyond. It wasn't monstrously beyond, as in the movie. In one of the recent movies, he was able to hold a helicopter to a platform with his bare hands. Right, so there's a huge difference there, and I think of the Sherlock Holmes stories as having that kind of huge difference between the popular media today and the original stories. But with that being said, they're still very enjoyable to read, right? He is still a fictional genius handling interesting, fictionally simplified cases in a fictional world, undergoing fictional adventure, so there's still a lot of fast-paced action going on. And there are multiple things I like about these stories. One of them is the fast-paced feeling of adventure that exists in these stories. I've read other detective short stories or books as well. I'm a big fan of Hercule Poirot. A lot of those aren't quite as energetic, quite as fast-paced, quite as invigorating as these stories are. So they do have a unique sort of energy to them. And beyond that, there are a lot of clever story elements at play, right? Plots, counterplots, plays, counterplays, ploys, gambits. So I think in most of these, you can kind of, if you're trying to figure it out as Sherlock Holmes goes through the motions, figures it out himself, there's almost enough for you to figure out the criminal yourself, or at least get a rough idea of who it is, who it isn't. In a few stories, there are just things that happen at the end of the story that totally change everything, but most of them you can at least follow along, try to figure things out for yourself. And that's definitely an element I like in these detective stories. So I definitely recommend reading it. It's definitely worth it. It's a classic piece of literature and definitely enjoyable to follow along, whether you try to solve the crimes yourself or not. So with that, let's move on to the next book. So next up is Season Lou's 3 Body Problem. I originally became aware of this book through the Netflix adaptation, actually. It came up on my Netflix recommendations. I looked at the description. I saw that it was based on a book, so I decided to put that away for now and read the book instead. I'm very glad I did that. The original book is phenomenal. These storylines are interesting, enthralling, to the point where I not only read this book, but I read the sequels, these books, these even bigger books, all 3 in less than 2 weeks' time. And the unique atmospheres, feelings evoked by the book stayed with me even between reading sessions, something which most great pieces of literature do. The storyline itself is built upon an interesting, highly effective premise. Without spoiling the story, I can say that the premise of the storyline is built upon a series of events that starts with an alien civilization on the brink of their own destruction. One of their listening stations receives a transmission from Earth and are able to pinpoint Earth's location, and through a series of events, Earth is aware that they're sending over an invasion. Due to constraints in the speed of light, it's going to take them centuries to get to Earth, so Earth can precisely calculate that at a specific future date, these aliens are going to arrive and destroy them. So there's a sense of impending existential doom that, if it can be avoided at all, only through the most cunning strategies, tactics, application of human innovation that humanity has ever seen. And there are some very clever attempts that are undertaken by humanity in order to try and ensure their own survival. It's kind of like an arms race between the ingenuity of the less advanced humans and the more advanced technology but limited resources and times available to that invading civilization. So there's a lot of interesting gambits, tactics, clever ploys, manipulations at play throughout all 3 of these books. The author does an excellent job of weaving together the decades and centuries back and forth. There's still plenty of time for character development to happen within these extended time spans, and the author does kind of jump back and forth, at least between all 3 book series, back and forth between what I'll call the major eras within the storyline. In addition to that existential dread, that sense of impending, inescapable doom, there's also an asymmetric element, right? The aliens' technology is so much more advanced than the humans' technology. And like I was saying before, seeing the attempts to kind of close that gap, or in other ways fight asymmetrically, is very interesting, entertaining to read. There's a lot of clever ideas in these book series. The first book in the series has a fantastic ending, but it's definitely a cliffhanger ending leading to the second and third books. This isn't a case where the book was written and then it did so while the author wrote a sequel. This was a planned trilogy, overarching storyline from beginning to end. And I can tell you the end of the third book I'll describe it as an unexpected, beautiful conclusion to all of these events, all of the grand ideas that are explored throughout the book series. Yeah, definitely lots of value packed into these 3 books. So for those reasons, I highly recommend you check out the entire book series. It's definitely worth the read. For now, let's move on to the next book. Next up we have Frida McFadden's Never Lie. So about half a year ago, I was looking for a way to break the mold that was forming with the monthly book recommendations, right? 3 out of the 4 previous recommendations were all science fiction. So I was trying to expand my horizons a little bit, find books that were in different genres by different authors with different writing styles. So I came across this book and decided to give it a chance, and I'm glad I did, because I did end up making this a monthly book recommendation. As I was getting into it, the writing style was different than I was used to. The style of narration, the character dialogue in particular was different. The way the characters internalize their own feelings, emotions, their own thoughts and ideas. And I wasn't actually sure for a while whether or not I was going to make it a monthly book recommendation. At first, I was kind of doubting, but I realized maybe that's just because I'm not used to this kind of writing style, so I decided to suspend my judgment until the end of the book. But the more I read it, the more I kind of got involved in it, the more I enjoyed the process of reading it. I actually finished the book in about a day and a half. I was drawn into it to the point where I basically binged the whole thing, which right there says something about the quality of the book. I would describe it as a sort of grab the popcorn, take a seat, and ride along as the story unfolds. There was a lot of humor in the book, a lot of funny elements, ironies, and there was some interesting twists and turns along the way. I'll say both temporally and in character discovery. But it was definitely a fun read, entertaining. I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad I experimented with a different genre. So for that reason, I made it the Book of the Month recommendation, and I highly encourage you to check it out. It'll be fun. For now, let's move on to the next book. Our next book is Continuum, edited by Annabelle Doladon and Tessa Sermet. This is a collection of French science fiction short stories translated to English for the very first time in this book. And the stories included are from multiple authors spanning multiple decades, each author having their own unique voice, writing style, and approach to science fiction itself. The stories in here are varied in topic, in length. Some of them are pretty long, almost novella length, while other ones are very short, and some in between. Something that really caught my attention in this book is throughout all of the short stories, there's something in there which I can only assume is some kind of ineffable, unique aspect of French literature, or maybe even French culture, that successfully crossed the translation barrier from its original writings into this English book. It has some kind of unique essence that I've never seen before in a book, science fiction or otherwise. So there's definitely some unique elements at play in this book. There are some interesting science fiction concepts themselves as well. I can't really go into it without spoiling any of the stories, but there are some very creative elements at play here. And just like any good story, these science fiction stories explore themes regarding humanity, society, culture, education, and other such topics. Right? There's always something on its mind to a certain degree, something that's being explored by the characters, their thoughts, their emotions, and their actions. So there's always something at a high level to take away from the book as well. So like some of the other books we've talked about, you can read it to go along for the ride, follow some of the interesting ideas, as well as explore the overarching concepts that these stories dive into. So it's definitely a unique book, one I definitely recommend you to read, even if you're not interested in science fiction, just because there's a certain cultural crossover element at play here, which I think alone is reason enough to read this book. So I highly recommend you check it out. But for now, let's go over to the next book. Next up, we've got The Intelligence Trap by David Robson. The subtitle of this book is Why Smart People Make Dumb Mistakes, and the book does an excellent job of exploring the reasons behind this phenomenon. The book operates under the principle that intelligence and stupidity are not actually opposite ends of a spectrum. A person can be intelligent and stupid at the same time. On the one hand, that might sound paradoxical, but on the other hand, I'm sure all of us can think of at least a few examples where we've personally witnessed somebody who's intelligent making stupid mistakes, making stupid decisions that run counter to their own goals or well-being. So throughout the chapters, the book introduces different concepts, different reasonings why this might happen, and then explores them with examples and psychological studies. One of the ones that stuck out to me the most was this notion of earned dogmatism, which is a situation where a person believes that they've contributed intellectually to some field to the point where they can have their own beliefs without holding those beliefs to the same standards of rigor that they would hold for their professional endeavors. Another topic the book discusses is this notion of motivated reasoning, which is a situation where you use your intellect and your knowledge in an attempt to prove one of your beliefs is true. That might sound reasonable on the surface, but the correct thing to do is to use those capabilities to find the objective truth, which does carry a risk that you confirm your beliefs are false, requiring you to change them. So if the goal is to prove your beliefs are true, and that's it, then there's a motivation there, bias there that will disrupt your reasoning process. So the book does an excellent job of diving into how that works, how to mitigate it, how often that occurs, and other pertinent topics. Overall, the book is easy to read, easy to follow along with. It has a lot of useful information, dives deep into different kinds of biases, different kinds of errors in reasoning. So I definitely encourage you guys to check it out. It's definitely worth the read. But for now, let's continue on to the next book. This next book is a compilation of some of H.P. Lovecraft's stories called The Complete Cthulhu Mythos Tales. So I found this after trying to expand my horizons again, find books that I don't typically read, and this is actually my first introduction to the genre of horror. And H.P. Lovecraft certainly gave me quite the introduction. I would say he specializes in an offshoot called cosmic horror, which is horror at cosmic scales. You can think of huge space, outer space, cosmic space, as well as aeonic time spans encompassing hundreds, thousands, millions of years. From the start, I could see that H.P. Lovecraft has a highly sophisticated writing style. He has a command of vocabulary and descriptive power second to none. It makes the stories very rich in their world building, character building, fantasy building, idea building even, but it is harder to read. It's a very dense book. You really have to sit down with it, and you might have some trouble. You might have to look up some words every once in a while, but it's very powerful writing, and the ideas themselves are incredible. H.P. Lovecraft has what I describe as a sublime imagination. He's always able to come up with new, creative, complex, or simple ideas that go into these stories, and he's always able to increase the scope as he goes, right? Some of the stories in the second half of the book keep growing and growing and growing in terms of size, space, complexity, time, right? He's able to reach farther into time, into the future or into the past, across the eons. He's able to reach across space, reach across conceptual space, we'll call it, as well. Right? There's never an end to the creativity that he can pour into these stories. There was never once a moment where I read a story in this book and thought, this is as good as it gets. It would always get better and better. It would always get more creative, more fantastic, more interesting as the stories went on. I almost feel as if I was reading him becoming a better author, story after story after story, as if I was witnessing his improvement in real time, which is saying something given the quality of the stories right up front. I've never read a book that quite painted these rich, vibrant landscapes as he does. So I'm definitely glad that I expanded my horizons again and jumped into this book. It is a thick book. It's 600 pages of very thick writing, large pages. It even has a little bookmark attached. It took me 2 weeks, slightly over 2 weeks to read this front to back, and it was very fatiguing. I was reading it mainly on the train rides to and from work, as well as reading it in my own home on some days, and it was a very fatiguing experience, right? To compare, when I read the 3 Body Problem series, that was 1,500 pages, and that took me slightly less time to read than this did. So it's very dense, so just keep that in mind. Density isn't a bad thing, it's just a matter of fact in this particular case. My only complaint, which isn't really a complaint, is that a lot of these stories don't really revolve around Cthulhu. There are some where he was a central piece, or at least an auxiliary component, but a lot of them were included just because they offhand referenced him. One of the characters maybe just said his name in a list of names of elder gods or eldritch horrors, whatever. And some of them didn't even reference him at all, so I wish that the book was a little bit more upfront about it, but with that being said, I don't really mind in the end because this was still a fantastic collection of short stories. So it's a challenging read, but highly worth it. So if you're going to read one book from this video, from my 2024 Book of the Month recommendations, I would say do this one. But for now, let's move on to the next book. Our next book is Isaac Asimov's Foundation, a classic piece of science fiction literature. This book chronicles the decline of a galactic empire from within, and a powerless organization's attempt to mitigate those effects and usher in the galaxy out of the ensuing Dark Ages into a new age of Renaissance. In this book, Isaac Asimov writes very clearly with a simple yet effective writing style, so it's something that anybody can just pick up and read with no problem. But he is able to weave in complex storylines, subtextual dialogue, and thematic elements, which means that while anybody can just pick up and read the book, you're really going to have to engage with it in order to pick up everything the author is putting into these pages and really engage and understand the story overall with its thematic elements and its sort of speculative statements, I'll call them. As for the story itself, it's split into discrete chunks of time that span roughly 200 years, so each section of the book will focus on specific blocks skipping around. And there's an interesting temporal element at play, because on the one hand you're following along the story with these blocks, but on the other hand there's things that kind of suggest that these blocks of time have already happened. And the unique fictional concept of psychohistory, which is a science that can highly accurately predict the future based on human psychology, throws further considerations of time, of the future, of the past into the mix. So there's a lot of playing with time involved in this story. Throughout these blocks of history, I'll call them, the author is able to really build up suspense. There's sort of a slow burn element going here as well, where each single block has sort of a slow increase in tension, suspension, until a problem comes to what I'll call critical mass before the main characters need to apply their creativity and ingenuity to solving the problem. So this book's definitely a good read. I recommend you check it out. Check out some of the subsequent books in the series as well. Like I said before, it's definitely a classic in the literature of science fiction. But for now, let's move on to our final book recommendation. My last book recommendation for 2024 is The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. This is a collection of 18 of his science fiction short stories, all tied together by the story of the illustrated man himself, who appears at the beginning and end of the book. One of the things I really love about this book is the author's ability to create three-dimensional characters and bring them to life in the confines of just a few short pages within the book. He's able to give each of these characters their own unique backgrounds, motivations, self-doubt, and even guiding beliefs. And he's even able to make them grow as people within just those few pages that they each get. And those lifelike characters do a good job of bringing the stories themselves to life as well. So when we reach the conclusion, it has that much more impact as a result. As I was reading through these stories, I started to realize that the stories are about emotion. They're about evoking certain emotions. So some of them evoke emotions of, I would say, love, of familiarity, of nostalgia, of longing, of yearning, which I think adds a touch of beauty to all of these stories. And some of these stories are very beautiful. In terms of the science fiction itself, he does have some interesting ideas here. Some of it seems anachronistic by today's standards. They talk about space rockets a lot, not spaceships, but space rockets or just earthbound rockets. But it doesn't detract from the stories at all. It's actually interesting to read it from a modern perspective, how things have changed. So in a certain sense, this book has aged very well since its original creation in the 50s. So most of the stories are pretty easy to follow along. They're written in nice bite-sized chunks. So I definitely recommend this as a good introduction book to anybody who wants to dive into the world of science fiction. And it's a good book even for those who are already well-versed in that area. So for those reasons, I recommend this book as well. So that covers all of my book recommendations for 2024. I'm definitely looking forward to next year and seeing what I'll be recommending then. If you guys have any suggestions for me, books I can try out reading, possibly even recommend, please let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to take a look at new reading material, new genres, authors I'm not familiar with. For now, I have all of the books linked in the description below. If anything sounded interesting for you, please be sure to take a look. I have the books themselves and my own reviews of them written on my blog. If you made it to the end, please consider liking and subscribing. You can stay up to date on more of my book recommendations as they come in. But for now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.